Hello and welcome to the LINK Changemakers Series. I'm Michael Aiken, President of LINK Strategic Partner. As the name would imply, in this series, we bring together some of the most incredible changemakers that we can find who are leading deep and lasting community-based work around the globe. Originally, the panel you're seeing today was going to be done at South by Southwest EDU in March. And reflecting back on that, how much the world has changed since we were supposed to be together in Austin a few months ago. We're in the middle of a pandemic, a recession, a discussion on climate change that we see with fires on our TV every night, and a national and much too delayed moment of social reckoning, all against the backdrop of a truly divisive national election. Today, we're going to jump headfirst into a discussion on equity. Yes, this is a huge topic, and we're not going to solve it in one discussion. And I'm confident that we've all spoken on or listened to lots of panels on this topic recently. But today, we're really going to seek to break some new ground and reflect together on the path forward. It's my hope that as friends and colleagues, we can share personal reflections that will drive professional actions and some lessons from our professional lives that will lead to personal actions. In these moments of uncertainty, it's natural for people to be asking when things will get back to normal. I've said this many times before, but we're not going back to normal. We can't go back to normal. Normal is largely what got us to this point in the first place. Rather, I know we're all committed to working towards a new normal that isn't afraid to address head-on the inequity that led us here. So with that, let's dig in. We've got a really phenomenal panel here today. They represent the very best in education, business, and the nonprofit sector. And just personally, they are good people who I have the distinct pleasure of calling friends. So today we're joined by Colette Pierce-Burnett, President and CEO of Huston-Tillotson University in Austin, Texas. Cordell Carter II, Executive Director of the Socrates Program, the Aspen Institute, and Sekou Collin, Managing Director and Head of Advancing Black Pathways at JP Morgan Chase. I thank you all for joining us today. How's everyone doing? I'm doing okay? Perfect. I want to start with definitions. I find that often we jump headfirst into some of these discussions. We don't really define the words or the topics, and it leaves some folks out of the dialogue. So I'd like to just start by going around and getting your definition of equity, not the textbook definition, but your definition of equity and what you think of when people talk about applying an equity lens to the issues of the day. Does that work? Let's start with you, Madam President. How do you define equity?
First of all, thank you, Michael, for allowing me to be here. Even though I can't see you guys here in Austin, we're going to claim it that we're going to be in Austin for the next South by Southwest panel.
Absolutely.
So that equity lens, to me, it means deliberative. There's a difference between equity and equality. We're all equal. We can all vote. We all have that right and that privilege. But equity means something very different. It's being deliberate, and it's using the hard words like race, racism, dismantling racism, white supremacy. It's using those hard words to really move us into equity and being intentional about it. And intentionality means a continuity, not just in a moment when everybody's excited about it, but to continue to move. That's the push for true equity.
I appreciate that. Cordell, how do you define it?
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure to see all of you. It's a pleasure to see anyone, frankly. I'm missing human contact as a convener. This is a very challenging time for me. Much like Madam President, I think of deliberative actions and intentionality when I think of equity. It's this idea of recognizing that we all come to the table with different constraints, networks, pathways, advantages, and then being intentional about figuring out what does it take for each of us to maximize our utility. Our maximization looks different for each person, but the goal is to get people to maximize whatever they got. And you have to do that as an organization. That means you have to invest differently. You have to ask questions, and then you have to work with that person or work with those group of people to come to something that looks like a remedy for the issues that got you to that conversation. So
it makes perfect sense. Sekou, how do you define it?
I agree with my fellow distinguished panelists. So what I'll just add to briefly is, for me, equity is about fairness. Everyone deserves a chance to achieve success economically or otherwise, but we all know that opportunity is not distributed equally to all people. And so looking through with an equity lens, for me, it means looking for ways to include all people in opportunities for success, whether it be career, finances, for their lives, or just as a whole. So picking up, on what Cordell said, I think it is about that opportunity for inclusion and access.
Absolutely. I want to tie this into the work that all of you lead in your very large professional roles every day. So let's unpack this a little bit. Madam President, I'd love to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about Huston-Tillotson University? Who are you serving? How large is it? Just kind of root us in the power of Huston-Tillotson. And then I'd love to unpack how your role has changed recently. I know over the past few months you've been in it, and I'd love to unpack that a bit. So tell us about HTU.
We have 1,100 students. We're a historically Black college right in the heart of Austin, one of the most prosperous cities in some ways in the US. And of the 1,100 students, 45%, close to half of them are first generation. So we still live in a country with quote unquote first generation, first in your family to go to college. And over 70% of my students are Pell eligible, which by definition from the federal government, they come from families of low socioeconomic status. So that's our population. I feel very blessed where my personal and professional passions have intersected to be able to serve as a leader at a historically Black college. I did not attend a historically Black college, but I have a deep passion for the mission by nature of what we do and how I see young people come and they can blossom in this environment to really come into their greatness. We call our students the genius generation. We have no language of lack on this campus. We don't talk about less than, underserved, the traditional words marginalized, et cetera, because we want students to recognize their greatness inside of them. And this environment is that one for them to be able to do that. The pandemic has compounded the life that we live every day when it comes to inequities and attempting to move into thriving. So there's a famous quote by W.B. Du Bois that says, education and work are the levers to lift a people, to uplift. And education is the great equalizer. All of us on this panel, if we had stopped at high school, our lives would have taken a very different trajectory. And in all of those pillars of society, what we're seeing right now as a result of the pandemic is people that are most greatly impacted in a negative way are not in a situation where they have the kind of healthcare that they need, the kind of jobs that they need. The level of access to economic development, economic prosperity, and that comes from uplifting a citizenry through education. So I'm very pleased to do this every day. It's hard, it's stressful, it's expensive, especially when you're serving people who are from a poor family. We break generations of poverty. And finally, I'll say that two of the hardest decisions that I've had to make, the first one was postponing commencement, because commencement is a rite of passage because we're graduating families, not individuals. So having to postpone that and take that from families was hard. The second hard decision was we opened our campus up, and this is in response to your how has my role changed. We opened the campus up for Austin's Black Lives Matter movement march. And we had over 20,000 people on this campus. It was really a moment in history in Austin. And that is the beacon of hope that the institution really represents, and staying grounded in the roots of who we are and staying proud and to continue to fight for that equity, because we were founded 10 years after Juneteenth. So we're 145 years old, older than the University of Texas at Austin. So the grit and the resilience.
Madam President, I'd love to come back to this a little bit more and just really unpack what it must be like to make some of those leadership decisions of canceling commencement. And then you guys have gone fully remote for the fall, correct?
That's correct. We're fully online.
Right, which given all of the data that you had access to, certainly seems like the prudent and responsible decision. But I'm sure that decision, combined with opening up your campus for a rally, combined with all the other things you have to decide in the moment, there are some conflicts in decision making at times. How do you prioritize those when you're faced with each individual and unique moment that comes before you?
One thing that I've learned is I have to follow my moral compass, because when the decision to go fully online was a very complicated decision, as you could imagine, because we automatically lost over $1 million in revenue. For a small school like us, that's big, because we don't have the housing and the dining revenue. However, when we followed the science and we looked at the data and the statistics, I have a predominantly, my staff and my students and my faculty clearly are all mostly of color. And we live in a very metropolitan area. and the pandemic is bigger than we are. And there's an expense associated with not opening, having fully online, and there's an expense in the other way. But to protect my students and their families was utmost important. And we also had to figure out how to overcome the technology barrier, because we surveyed our students when we suddenly went online in the spring, which is a miracle in and of itself because we are not an online school, but we successfully lifted this institution within 2 weeks. So we surveyed the students, and the two biggest barriers to their success in online learning was technology and their mental well-being. So we've addressed both of those by providing every student with a tablet and internet access. And we've partnered with a corporate partner to be able to offer telecounseling for students who need it, or even yoga. We're doing all kind of innovative, creative things. So it's been a challenge. The technology barrier was really an eye-opener to me, because when we first decided to close, students were packing their things and going home back in the spring. In March, right around South by Southwest, which is when the pandemic became real for me, when that got canceled. But a student said to me, Dr. Burnett, I don't have internet access at home. And at that time I said, that's all right, you can go to McDonald's or Starbucks to get access. And little did I know that that was not going to be an option. Yep. So that technology barrier for people is it's not a utility. And we take for granted that we all have access in our homes.
I appreciate that. And we'll come back and unpack more of this as we continue. Cordell, I'd love to go to you next. You're part of the leadership team of a very well-known international nonprofit, and you lead a program that really convenes deep discussions around the world on the issues of the day. Can you unpack for us what Socrates is and how it has evolved, if it's evolved, to kind of meet the demands of this unique moment that we're in?
Sure thing. So the Aspen Institute was created in the late 1940s, simply around this idea that if we can't bring leaders together to find their common humanity, we will have a World War III sooner than we want to, right? And so, we have to get leaders together. So for 45 years, they were bringing great leaders together. The problem that they started recognizing in the late 90s was that all these leaders looked the same. They were from the same networks. They had the same archetype professionally. And this thing called the internet was happening. And this thing called Silicon Valley was starting to prop up. And as Netscape, that first web browser, commercial web browser, was getting off the ground in 95, 96, some younger Aspenites that were closely connected to trustees said, listen, if you all don't change this institution and bring in younger people, more diverse leaders, you're going to disappear. And they heard the call. And in 1996, we created the Socrates Program, which is a global education forum for emerging leaders, introduce them to values and ethics-based, expertly moderated Socratic dialogue. So instead of a philosopher standing with a group of middle-aged men in the forest talking about Antigone, we talk about net neutrality and the ethical dimensions of that. What are our roles as leaders? Yes, I may be a nonprofit, we may have a banker and we have a university president, but we all have a role to play. And so let's contend with these very serious issues of leadership, but let's do it in a fun way. And so for the last 24 years, we have been actively involved, growing the network, doing seminars all over the world. Last year, we did seminars in 12 countries. We had 15 countries slated this year, and from 13 seminars when I started 3 years ago to 36 in 2020, and we had 7 done before February. 3 of them were international, and then all of a sudden, our world changed. So it took us about a month to pivot. Everything went digital. We did something we normally don't do. We love deep contact. A whole weekend somewhere in the world where 25 people really get to know each other well. I call it adult summer camp, right? We get really, really close. We really engage each other, but we have an amazing experience. You can't do that online, okay? And so we started doing webinars. We have a plethora of moderators that have led seminars for us over the last 24 years. Those are the first people we called. We have 8,000 alums that are rising in their respective fields. They're making change happen wherever they live. Those are the next people we called. And we said, let's start doing weekly events. And so we've been doing webinars. In fact, 2 hours from now, we're doing one on conspiracy theories. And this book was by one of our moderators named Russ Muirhead, who just led seminar for us last summer in Aspen. And so we're looking forward to just putting more topics on the table. We didn't know we could reach so many people that we're reaching now. So back to the pivot. In addition to this great material that we've created the last 24 years, we realized there's a different audience that we haven't reached. We haven't spent a lot of time talking to boards of directors. We created this thing called Becoming an Inclusive Republic that looks at contemporary and more recent texts, and arguing that every generation of leaders in this country has actually expanded enfranchisement to more Americans. Like, we're actually growing our notion of inclusion, but that's not the headlines. Like, there's this undercut that's actually happening. The background and music of this republic is that we're growing and expanding our notion of inclusion, right? And so boards of directors wanted to hear that. Corporate teams wanted to hear that. And so for the last 5 months, probably 30 different iterations of Becoming an Inclusive Republic I've delivered to different corporate teams. We have a group of CEOs from foundations we're doing next week. We have many international partners, 7 of them that have signed up, from Bosnia and Herzegovina to Czech Republic to Germany to Mexico, all want to understand more about what's going on in American leadership right now. We are the hot topic. And so we've changed quite a bit. I never expected to engage this many people in such a short amount of time, but we have. And the goal for next year is, how can we do more and be better?
It's an impressive pivot, and I want to come back to the dialogue portions a bit later and really engage in that generational discussion. I know President Burnett has some thoughts on that as well, so we'll come back. But Sekou, let's go to you. Tell us a little bit about your role, JP Morgan Chase. Tell us what Advancing Black Pathways is, and then I'd really love to get some of your insights in the specific financial challenges that Black students and businesses are facing, especially now, and how some of the programs you're running are trying to address that.
Well, great. I'll pivot too, because I want to pick up on some of those other topics discussed. But we launched Advancing Black Pathways in 2019 to really focus on strengthening the economic foundation of the Black community. And we're doing that by leveraging both our business and philanthropic resources to invest or accelerate growth for African Americans across 3 areas: education, careers, and wealth creation. And obviously, we've had to pivot with COVID. And one of the things we did, and I appreciated Madam President's comments, is we also looked at the fact that commencement celebration for HBCU students is a coming of age thing. And so what we did was sponsor, working with UNCF and Thurgood Marshall, but the first ever virtual commencement to really acknowledge and highlight these students. And it was one of my proud moments of this year to get President Obama to speak, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Tim Scott, a host of celebrities, arts, entertainers, Black executives, to really come together and recognize the tremendous achievement of these HBCU graduates. And her numbers as well are consistent with all HBCUs, and that is, 70% of all HBCU students are Pell Grant eligible. And so I'll talk about the financial piece and implications in a minute. But for us, that was just the moment, right? The movement for us was, we knew that students were having these difficulties. How could they access information, pursue jobs in a difficult market? So we launched a movement of a career readiness series in collaboration with LinkedIn. So we set 6 series just on LinkedIn, where we basically talked about reinventing your career in these transformative times. Financial health, how do you pursue jobs, where we are hiring right now. And on our Advancing Black Pathways website, we had you go in, look for jobs that are available for you today. We talked about careers as a financial analyst, even, because we need more financial analysts of color in our communities. And so financial advisor, rather. And so that was great. And I'll tell you, how you see timing is everything. We had set a small goal of 25,000 views for our LinkedIn Career Readiness Series. We got 225,000 views, and it shows the hunger that people have to get access to this information. Another thing that we did that was timely was, as she indicated, not only with the students that are Pell Grant eligible for HBCUs, but in general, 45% of Black students come from poverty zip codes. So we knew that one of the key impacts or key things that that cause Black students to drop out are sometimes financial hardship. So we launched in February at our 1-year ABP anniversary, a financial hardship fund with the purpose of providing emergency grants. And we're working with Thurgood Marshall and UNCF to these to these students rather, to enable them to stay in school. But the grant isn't everything. We also wrap around jobs. We also wrap around a curriculum of financial health. And so in that COVID era, we helped 600 students just get home that didn't have the financial resources to get home. And then we also, in partnership, worked with another school to house another 600 students. Again, 1,200 students, a small number, but in the big scheme of things, that was very impactful for those particular students. So we've had to pivot to offer more content online, whether it's financial health, same thing, curriculum for students. And so we're doubling down on a lot of our efforts to truly support students. And the last thing I'll just say about businesses, we've lost at some estimates nearly 500,000 Black businesses already, which there were only 2.6 million to begin with. So we're doubling down on our efforts there as well.
That's amazing, Sekou. Could you unpack for us a little bit about advancing Black pathways as a whole? Just set the stage for folks on what the initiative is.
Yes. So advancing Black pathways as a whole, so what we're focused on is really, again, how do you create scalable solutions to address some of the persistent problems that have existed given structural inequities, racism, systemic racism. And so what we knew, though, is that as a bank and the largest bank in this country, we have a responsibility for the communities we serve, and we're well positioned to actually do some of the things that can help close the racial wealth gap. Now, one company alone cannot do it all, right? And so part of our intentionality was, how could we create a roadmap or playbook that could be used for not only just the Black community, but any underserved community, but also get other people to come along the journey. And the best example I'll give you of why we took that approach, we launched this Veterans Job Initiative with a couple of other companies 10 years ago. And when it started, it was the 10,000 Jobs Initiative, right? Then with all these companies, we hired 100,000 veterans, then 500,000 veterans, and now it's the Million Veterans Jobs Initiative. So it just shows that when you take a leadership position and leverage, your assets, your resources, you could get people to come along the journey to make a difference. And so that's what we've done. And I will tell you, I won't mention the names, but we've had the opportunity to consult many of the largest tech companies in this world, many other large companies, on what they can do in this moment to drive change. And so our hypothesis, came into to be, and that is, because we were ahead of the curve on some of these issues, we had a lot of information to share that people could tweak to make a difference in their own way, in their swim lane, right? And so we've been happy to be able to consult and help and share any information and do whatever we can to help collectively move together and move forward in this country to close the racial wealth gap and begin to create a more inclusive economy and growth.
I'm going to stick with you for a little bit, Sekou, because I want to pivot us a bit to the big ideas discussion, right? I mentioned at the start of this that this is a really big topic, and we're going to get to really specific actions in just a bit, but I want to stay big picture for a moment. So we're in this odd time where some people who were barely hanging on pre-pandemic are finding themselves in the deepest financial challenges their families have ever faced. And on the other side of it, we have folks who are benefiting from a stock market that often seems very disconnected from the realities of the moment. As you look at all of that, sitting in the financial services sector that you're in, can you broaden a little bit and continue to talk more about the role that you think corporations and kind of the business community as a whole should or could or has the responsibility of playing in issues of equity?
Yeah, and I'll give even context or some stats around your comment. So our Chase Institute does a lot of research. And so we basically looked at the cash balances for Black and brown companies. And before the pandemic, Black and brown companies, the majority only had 2 to 3 weeks of cash, right? And so if you think about how long this pandemic has been going on, that's why you've lost a lot of that businesses, because their starting point was different. And I'll drill down to consumer level. I'll pick a city, Boston, Massachusetts. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the median net worth for Blacks in Boston is $8 compared to $247,500 for a white family. Or now you see it takes the net worth of 12 Black families to equal the net worth of one white family. So when you talk about your starting place was already one of pain in many instances, and then this pandemic has caused, unemployment, where if you think about the march on Washington for jobs, like, Congressman Lewis, Martin Luther King, all of them, Whitney Young, there was a whole policy. It was about jobs and all these policies, housing, all this thing. Today, unemployment for Blacks is higher than it was in 1963. The housing ownership for Blacks is lower than it was when housing discrimination was legal. Just think about that in 2020, where housing discrimination is illegal. Our Black home ownership rate is lower than it was when housing discrimination was legal. So what can companies do? Because you don't want to admire the problem, but it will require intentional acts and policy that enable us to be able to close this wealth gap. So getting capital to these business owners, having policy and growth, and for companies, and I'm optimistic that in my dozens and dozens of discussions with some of the largest companies in this world, they're looking to see how they leverage their resources to begin to make impact at scale. There's organizations like the Business Roundtable, which is the top 200 corporations. There's a body of work there. So I'm not saying we could take any victory laps yet, but in my career in financial services, I've never seen the corporate America so galvanized to look to make impact on trying to create solutions that really get at the heart of addressing some of these persistent issues that our country has faced.
I appreciate that so much, Sekou. And those statistics, well, we don't want to admire the problem. They make it real. They help provide some data between kind of what we're talking about and the why now and why now so urgently. So thank you for sharing those. Cordell, I want to.
And one quick thing. Let me
Please
just give one last statistic to, again, the urgency of the situation. Before COVID, Blacks were on the path to zero median net worth by 2053. So just think of what COVID then has done. And so we've made tremendous strides in educational attainment, et cetera. But it's clear that alone, you can't out-education some of these wide chasms and wide gaps. You can't out-earn some of these wide gaps. So you do need policy. You do need collaboration with nonprofits, incredible organizations like Aspen, government. Like, this is a journey that we're going to have to walk arm in arm together to truly make a difference.
Absolutely. And thank you for saying that. I think we've got to kind of settle into this moment and not look to what can we do to just take enough of the discomfort away that we go back to what people were thinking about pre the last few months. We got to stay here and really wallow in solutions for a while. I want to build on that, Cordell. You work in the foundation space, right? You work in the nonprofit space. And like we've seen with personal economic wealth in the stock market, we're seeing a lot of the same thing in the nonprofit space. We're seeing nonprofits who have more demands for their service than ever, and their funding drying up. We also see foundations whose endowments are growing at a record pace because they're tied to some of the investments that are doing well. So how do you see the role of the sector that you're in confronting this?
Well, like the elites in the private sector and the public sector, your biggest fish are going to survive. They're doing just fine. I happen to be one of those organizations that's doing just fine. We've adjusted our work, but the most important thing we can do is twofold as a sector. One, an organization like mine has to walk the talk. Okay, we have to interrogate our own practices. There's this old Southern saying that goes, "Sweep around your own back porch before you sweep someone else's." Okay, and so we've been talking about equity and fairness and diversity for multiple generations now. But how diverse are our boards? How diverse are our executive staffs? What about our hiring practices? Is it done by word of mouth? Is it done because you only go to one school, the one you attended? Or is it completely open? So we're going through that process now as a sector of really interrogating in a very rigorous way our own practices. And I think we should be quiet for a minute and do that. Secondly, the funders. Here, the market makers in the social sector are your largest funders. I would say JP Morgan Chase is one of them. You know, the people that are actually pumping in resources so that you can execute on funding strategies. They can dictate to their grantees, listen, we need you to be equity-focused organizations. We've identified several groups that can help you do that. We will fund it, but you got to do this if you want to continue receiving funding from us. Some of our larger funders are going through those conversations right now. I'm a part of a few of those conversations, but they're just literally stopping whatever they're doing and saying, let's take a look and see how we're part of the problem. One great example I'll give you, because it just launched today, is representative democracy. The Democracy Fund, which is part of the Meteor Network, funds a lot of institutional strengthening mechanisms for Congress, for democracy at large. And we have a piece of our work called Emerging Governance Leaders, and we're focused on congressional staffers of color. When you're a young staffer on the Hill, you're not getting the type of opportunities that, say, a senior committee staffer would get, you know, CODELs, professional development, a lot of free training you're getting and a great exposure. So we've created a mechanism so they can get these amazing weekend experiences that the Sekus and Dr. Burnett's of the world would get. They're getting it much earlier in their career, and this is great for their career. So there are several organizations that do this besides Aspen. We've all joined a coalition to focus on strengthening the pipeline, the diverse pipeline for the Hill. Why is that important? Because the people that are vetting judicial candidates, that are writing legislation, that are setting legislative calendars, need to reflect their communities that are going to be affected by it. Okay, there's a good reason a lot of policy doesn't make sense. You know, it doesn't make sense by design. So we have to change the designers. And so this Representative Democracy Coalition's repdemocracy.org, just launched today by Democracy Fund, is part of a 3-year effort they've been on. They gave us all this training on DE&I 2 years ago, before it was a hot topic. They provided communications consultants that would help us change the way an equity or focused organization speaks and delivers content. Okay. And then moreover, they gave us funding to keep the program going. That's a tremendous investment. And that is the purpose of funders in the social sector. They are the risk capital for humanity. Okay. And I need that risk capital to take more risk. All right. So anyhow, I think those are some great examples of sweeping around your own back porch.
I love that. And I'd love to follow up on one of those. I've seen a really positive use of what you're talking about we will fund you and we want you to do this. And I've seen we will fund you only if you do it our way, and that doesn't align with what sometimes the smaller nonprofits or organizations are able to do. How do you kind of live in that tension and make sure it's not overly dictating what people closest to the ground need?
That's a great point. I'm about to say something controversial if I haven't already. There are a lot of nonprofits that shouldn't exist. Okay, M&A activity in the private sector is considered normal. It's not considered normal in the social sector. I think that's a problem. Okay, some of us need to be great followers. That's also a type of leadership. And so if there's competing organizations, make it easy for the funders. Now the funders can also push this, right? Now, also, I think people invest in nonprofit leaders because they are problem solvers. If you haven't figured out how to solve your own problem without their help, how can you make the argument that you're going to definitely solve it with their help? Okay, and so I think twofold. You have to be a great problem solver, have a great leader, making sure that you've done a landscape analysis so you're not replicating work that's already done. And frankly, if it's not on strategy for you, if it's not on mission for you, that's funding you can't accept. You got to figure out another way. So all of us around here need some courage. Okay, we need some courage, we need some truth. Maybe I don't need to exist. Maybe there's someone that can do it better. Who can I partner with? Who can I go be VP somewhere instead of being executive director? It'd be a load off, trust me.
I've never seen you shy away from a topic, Cordell, and that's what makes you such a great panelist. I want to keep in that honesty vein, and I want to go to Madam President. So we're talking a lot about the role that the corporate sector could, should, and does play, and the role that the foundation and nonprofit sector could, should, and does play. You're in the middle of trying to raise $1.6 million to get technology and tablets for your students who need them now. So kind of level set us. Where are you seeing the role of corporate and foundation theoretically in kind of the HBCU higher ed movement, and where are you seeing it practically in, I need to raise some funds now? What has that been like?
It's been a very eye-opening journey. When I launched the $1.6 million, and this is a lived experience, it's a true lived experience. When I launched the $1.6 million campaign, if you will, I just knew in my mind that Austin was going to embrace us and we would easily raise $1.6 million. Easy is relative, but I knew we could do it. And I have been unpleasantly surprised that we are at 900,000 as opposed to the 1.6 million. What I have learned is that organizations want to invest where it's quote unquote sexy with the big names. We've seen a lot of that lately with you among the HBCU community. And I'm married to a Morehouse graduate. My son went to Hampton, so I say this in love. The same 5 schools get the same large investments. The Morehouses, the Howards, the Hamptons. I could name probably about 5 of them, sometimes Tuskegee. And that's really, it's investing to grow as opposed to investing to heal. And my experience here in Austin is that people are, it's really systemic racism, where you're leery to invest because you want a good story to invest in, but you can't tell the real story and lift the real good story without the investment. So you want me to be you want me to be financially grounded before you invest in me, but I can't get financially grounded until you invest in me. And it has also been my experience that many of the wealthy foundations, philanthropic organizations here in Austin, or individuals, are more apt to invest in white organizations serving Black people as opposed to Black organizations serving Black people. Or if they do want to invest, then they are wanting to invest and tell you how you do it, without confidence in the fact that we're 145 years old, we've got this. We just need to have more investments to be able to have the capacity to do more of it. So, I want to really lift something that Cordell said earlier. I really liked his term that he used about background music. And it's been my experience that it is background music, that Black Lives Matter in public, all these statements that came out, and then when the Black Lives Matter really don't matter in private. And that's background music, as opposed to it being the theme song. And you get people with lived experiences to help to make the decisions. And I'm gonna mess this up, but I think Ayanna Pressley just made it, just lifted this quote again about those closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. So when you're making these philanthropic decisions, who's making those decisions? And you are apt to give to your alma mater. There's so many cases here where people invest in the University of Texas foundations. And then when Houston Tillotson, which is Austin's oldest institution of higher learning, approaches, it's always something else. We have to continue to dance for our supper, almost to a point where it's exhaustive. And when you talk about grant making, I don't have the kind of staffing that a University of Texas would have when it comes to a sponsored programs or a research organization, research entity or department that write the grants. So then I'm very, very proud of Austin Community Foundation here in Austin, because they have been extremely intentional about looking at how they go about funding, and they have an equity metric in their funding to look at how many people of color do you have on your board. Who are you servicing? Which is back to what Cordell is saying. We have a lot of nonprofits doing a lot of the same thing. That repetitive mission, if you will. So, and I really admire the work that they've done in order to make it a more equitable process when you are awarding grants to institutions who are really doing the hard work and have been doing it for a long time with limited resources. And then the final thing I would say is helping to tell the real story. Historically Black colleges, generally, people tend to consistently want us to put us in a place of defending ourselves. And the mission is so invaluable. We built the middle class, and that work is not over. The data tells the story. And we have studied to exhaustion the situation that we find ourselves in. So it's not playing the violin, but sounding the trumpet. and helping to tell the narrative and to invest to heal, as opposed to just investing to grow in your thought process of how you are investing money into different entities that are doing the hard work on a daily basis and with results, showing results.
This is the real part of the discussion that I want us to stay in, because it's not the stuff that gets covered in a lot of these panels. It's not the stuff that gets talked about a lot, but it's the real stuff. And Madam President, the last thing I would ever try and do is put any words in your mouth, but I'm wondering if what I'm hearing a little bit is, when you were thinking that you would be able to go out and relatively easily raise this money, that was based at some level on the relationships that you've generated in Austin, the rooms you're invited into on Black History Day and month, the talks that you're giving. But then when the request goes in the other direction, it sounds like you're getting a lot more of, well, we can help you with capacity building, but we need your reporting structure to be this, as opposed to, we can help with your tangible need in the moment. Tell me if I'm paraphrasing any of that incorrectly.
No, that's exactly right. I have a lot of passion around it, so I'm picking my words. I did not think that, and also I still need to raise money in Austin. So relatively easy meant that there were about 4 or 5 companies, tech and foundations, that I thought if I could get each of them to lean into approximately 100,000, which is a drop in the bucket, then we would make tremendous progress. We've of the 900,000, the majority of that has been individual donations. So it's very interesting how we've gotten to the 900,000. So when we started approaching entities, and they will all remain nameless, one actually suggested that I repurpose some money that they gave us for another program for this cause. So that would hurt the other program. And then I read in the paper 2 weeks later that they've invested in University of Texas, or I'm saying University of Texas, but whoever, without question. Mm-hmm. So it has really been an eye-opening experience for me, how the responses that I've received. And it's not all, because we have some straight shooter partners that have been in this before Black Lives Matter, before civic unrest, before COVID-19, and they continue to step up to the plate. So I have really come to recognize true intentionality, and it's about the people that are in the decision-making positions and where their own heart is, because this is heart work. It's not hard work. It's who you are as a person and how you make decisions, and whether you're truly leaning into wanting to really make change, to be a change maker, and how courageous you are. Because sometimes it's easier to retreat and say that, we can't do this for this reason, as opposed to being bold and courageous and step out there and take risks to say that this is what we stand for. As a philanthropic organization, we truly want to address the racial issues that we have here in our city or in our state or county or whatever it is. And there are some leaders in this area that have been very brave. The mayor is an example of that. Back in 2019, he started a task force on institutional racism and was advised not to use the word racism because people would not feel comfortable in the conversations. And we have progressed forward. So Austin has started the challenge. And when people get discouraged and tired, that just spins my head around, because the civil rights movement, John Lewis is a classic example because he's top of mind for all of us now. That was not his first attempt at crossing that bridge. So when we get tired or frustrated and we want to step back, I think that's really cowardly of us. This is a constant movement. It's constant work. It's consistently being brave and courageous in your own sphere of influence. You don't have to be an Angela Davis or a Martin Luther King, these iconic, we can all do work in our individual. My fellow panelists are doing work in their individual spaces and making individual change. So it's like the ripple in the water. Eventually it will make great change, but you can't get tired. You have to continue to lean in and follow your moral compass and continue to do the hard work courageously.
I so appreciate that. And I think sometimes we need to step back and have that, okay, we're going to keep moving forward type of dialogue. I actually want to spend most of the rest of our time together, because I know these panels go very quickly, on the role of dialogue. Cordell and the Socrates Program recently coordinated a panel, which I sat on, about moving from the performative to the normative when it comes to equity and racial justice. The idea was, yes, your social media post about Black lives is welcome, but what do you do after that? So I was discussing this panel recently with President Burnett, and she reflected that between performing and norming, there's often a storming phase, and we're probably deep in the midst of the storming phase right now. And I was reflecting that storming phase is uncomfortable, but I'm going to argue that it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, and it needs to be uncomfortable for a while. As leaders, as a country, we need to stay uncomfortable long enough to actually confront these issues in a real and lasting way, not in a way that pushes them down just enough to get back to whatever normal feels like for people of privilege. But especially that requires dialogue, and dialogue with people who aren't like you, people who don't agree with you, and that's hard, and that's really, really hard. Cordell, you operate in the arena of dialogue. That's the whole idea behind Socrates. So give us some practical advice. How do we get better at dialogue? How do we kind of square the accountability, understandable accountability demands of cancel culture with the need to actually build pathways for improvement and understanding? How do we get better at dialogue?
Yeah, I'm doing this with a university on the West Coast right now. The students and some faculty members would like to remove a statue of George Washington that's on campus. And it's problematic because his name is in the university. And so, but it forced me to reflect on cancel culture, and also remember 21-year-old Cordell Carter, who thought everyone older than 21 was wrong. Okay. So some empathy with the mindset. I think, you greatly limit your options when the only option is to tear down, right? If that's your own solution. And I think part of the moral reckoning that we're experiencing right now is a great desire to have a process. They don't care what it is, as long as it's rigorous, as long as it's honest, to deal with the legacy of people we venerate. And the reason they have their stakeholders in that conversation is because we venerate via statues, via organizations that are publicly funded, okay? If you look at the great lost cause that happened around the South, those public memorials, the ones that are being debated right now, were put up with public dollars. They're maintained by public dollars. Therefore, the public gets a right to say, I don't think it should exist anymore. I'm not saying tear it down. I'm saying let's have a process. So I'll give you a great example of this recently. It's the Eisenhower Fellowship Program. Okay, it's named after Dwight D. Eisenhower, and they created this justice initiative in the wake of George Floyd's murder. They said, we have to do something. We're 2,000 dynamic, diverse alums all over the world. We're all about change and confronting tough issues, and we've been silent, so let's do something. I said, okay, well, first thing up, let's look at the legacy of our namesake. Is this a name we want to be associated with? Okay, if not, why? And so literally a group of folks, probably 60 people, including family members of Dwight D. Eisenhower, including former US governors, we walked through his civil rights legacy. I don't know if many people know, but in 1957, Dwight D. Eisenhower passed the Civil Rights Bill, okay, the first one since Reconstruction. His greatest opponents in that were Strom Thurmond, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, okay? And so look at the context that he was in. And the way you talk about something that happened 70 years ago is, did that person envision America that was different from the one they existed in? If they did, what did they do to move the rest of the country there? Okay, that's courageous leadership. Now, the problem with that is that you really have to segregate just domestic politics on one issue, because leadership is very complex. A lot of this is just gray. Sekou can tell you, so can Madam President. There's a lot of grayness you deal with. I wish more answers were black and white. It's just not the case. And part of dialogue is contending with the gray. It doesn't give you an answer, it gives you a process. And that is what the protesters are calling for. A process. And frankly, it's our job as leaders to model good behavior, to model really rigorous discussion of controversial topics publicly, and to show them, look, this is hard. And one day when you're leading, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But let me be as explicit as possible what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and why I disagree with you. but we're still respect each other. Okay, we can still work together. I just don't agree with you on this point.
That's so helpful. And Madam President, I'm going to go to you because you're kind of living that generational tension and opportunity every day. Like the civil rights struggle is not new to you. I know your personal history in this movement. It's long and it's noble. And you're also leading a campus of folks who aren't willing to be the leaders of tomorrow. They're the leaders of right now, and they're forcing us to address this. How have you found that generational struggle and opportunity to move forward?
You know, as a parent of grown children, my IQ has gone up and down over time. That's what Cordell was saying earlier. You know, I had a very high IQ when they were little, then a zero IQ when they were in their teens up to their mid-20s, and now I have a high IQ again. So I'm dealing with the population daily that, you know, thinks that your IQ is really low and you don't have any lived experiences. However, I am encouraged by youth. On my own campus, my students resurrected the NAACP chapter. 69AA is the chapter name. The fact that I know it means how powerful they are on this campus. And they did that of their own energy, their own device, recognizing what the NAACP stands for. But really, generationally, there was at some point where many people didn't even know what the NAACP stands for. But there is a rising of an awareness and of the power in collaborations and in organizational movements. So I think we need the expertise of the more seasoned individuals when it comes to the movement, but I think we need the energy of the youth. And I think we've often poo-pooed away young people as though they don't know what they're talking about, but it is from their energy and their fearlessness, and that we can really continue to propel this movement forward. Because if we don't allow the youth to be actively involved in these conversations and to be actively a part of the movement itself, just to use that word again, we're losing something. We're losing a lot of innovation, a lot of energy, a lot of wisdom, et cetera. So whenever I can include, whenever we are engaged in anything on campus, we have social justice weaved into everything on this campus, even our biology majors with environmental justice, every aspect of it. We teach English using Black superhero comics. So we're innovative as possible that we can be to infuse citizenry and social justice into how our students think and prepare them. We don't tell them what to think, but we have to tell them what to think about. And we stifle that if we don't lift the energy of young people. So I don't think there is a movement without them, because if you look at the ages of the icons of the civil rights movement, they were young. Right. I mean, it's amazing. They were young people. Yep. So often, I think in our minds, we make them middle-aged to older, but they were not. And John Lewis tells the story about how, they had to counsel him before his speech. So that was the expertise of the more seasoned, if you will, and the energy of the young, making for a very powerful step forward for a group of people.
And for those of you watching who've not had the chance to visit Huston-Tillotson University, it is a magical campus. It's not a big campus, and that's what makes it magical. It's right there. It is a phenomenal place. And Madam President, I crave the day when we can all be back in person, having this level of dialogue on your campus with your students at the forefront, because that's the dimension that misses from all of this that we need to bring into it. So we'll do that. Sekou, I wanna wrap up this section with you. You sit in corporate America. You've got a big role. You also see lots in the community. You also manage a lot of people. So when we start talking about dialogue, in your experience, what tips do you have for how to approach topics like equity, not just when you're in a leadership role, but often when you're not, when you're just starting out, or when you're in a job where the power dynamics are making it harder to speak up? How do you find your space and your voice in those moments?
I think I was a bit on something Madam President said in terms of the headset. So the headset of her children, did oscillate based on the more life experience they had. But the bigger point is, like, how can you be proximate and understand, like, what may be in the headset of others? And often as African Americans, we have the fortune of being understanding some of the headsets of others. And so I think when you have that view and then being proximate, you can help other people and you can help them be more proximate. And Brian Stevenson, really talks about the importance of that, and why it is important is if I talk to you or approach you or begin to learn more, then I engage in a different way. Whereas like if I'm not attuned to like some, specific things about, again, whatever the topic may be, and I come with a different headset, we may create tension from the outset, even if it wasn't intended, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us, and it just so happens I feel that, from my life experience, I'm attuned to the experiences of others who are, non-African American. But when you are attuned to that, then you also realize like how you could connect, how you could break down some of these topics. The best example, I think, with a lot of, the questions of why do we need an Advancing Black Pathways, or why do we need these initiatives? Well, people don't have the proximity, and they don't recognize the historical, the government policy that contributed to this, the corporate policy that contributed to this. So it was societal, right? And so when people are more proximate to, again, the causes versus looking at just the results of where we are today, then it makes it easier to understand and shift and change, that level of engagement. And so I think that's one of the big things that I'm optimistic about. Back to the youth, and I fully agree with her comments, as I love to see how the youth are really leading in this moment and passionate. And that's going to cause corporations to change as well, because these Gen Z, they don't want to work for a company that doesn't care about environment, that doesn't think about climate change, that doesn't think about some of these social economic issues, right? And so for companies to stay viable, right, they're going to have to really have views on some of these, what have been issues or challenges that weren't historically addressed in a corporate sector. And so again, that I am upbeat and optimistic, but I think all of that connectivity comes with being more proximate. Whether you talk about hiring, whether you talk about helping promote mentoring, it's if I understand and I take the time to engage with people outside of just my community, then I can look at talent differently and not have just my one lens of the checkbox where I want to replicate a mini me, right? So, and that's the last thing I'll quickly say. Our team for Advancing Black Pathways is diverse. It's Black, it's Asian, it's white, it's LGBTQ. Why? Because I wanted the best talent, and I also wanted to take advantage of different perspectives, right? And so the same way we thought about a program focused on the Black community in terms of getting the right talent in the seat is the same way we should think about inclusive growth and equity on any of these opportunities.
That is such a great point. I got advice very early in my career that served me so well, and I try and pass along to the new folks I'm mentoring. And it's, hold strong to your passions, but find a risk sponsor inside the institution that's going to have your back. So speak your truth, find a risk sponsor that will have your back and also help you frame it in a way that the folks you need to convert are going to hear it in a way that get them there faster. So I think there's something in all of this, and none of it's about watering down your convictions. It's all about find a way to move them to most effective change inside organizations. We are sadly out of time. Each one of these questions could be another hour, and I know we'll come back to them. And Madam President, I committed to coming back and doing this on your campus when we get to the point where we can be in person. But we're all gonna turn off our streams here in a little bit, and we're gonna go back to an overloaded inbox and the family responsibilities that are living just off our screen at the moment, and life's gonna take over. So as we go back into the life portion of our day, I'd love if each of you could send us off with a call to action. Give us something that we can take into our work as we move forward. Does that sound good? Sekou, let's start with you. What's the call to action as we get ready to leave and go on with our day?
For me, the call to action is simple. Let's not miss this moment to make transformative change and move our society, our country, and world into a better place where there's greater growth, there's greater harmony, and that we're doing things to protect our environment. And it starts with one small step, the step we can take today. One person alone doesn't have to create the change in the world, but collectively with us marching forward, that's how the change will happen.
I love that. Cordell, call to action, sir.
Read more. There's so much to learn from world history, how great empires rose and fell. There are a lot of parallels to be made. Read American culture. The richness of America is its diversity. These lived experiences from people from all over the world. We fight against our biggest strength. It doesn't make sense. So read more, learn more, then talk to people around you about what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, what you've read. Engage in dialogue, and then start to model the world we want, one that's based on data, empathy, and justice. We can do this one book at a time.
I love that. And if your reading is limited to what you're seeing on social media, if you agree with everything you're reading, you need to read some new stuff. Get a diversity of perspectives on what you're reading.
A book with pages.
Go ahead, Cordell. What'd you say?
I said a book with pages.
Book with pages, very specific. Madam President, the last word is yours. Send us off with your call to action.
I was going to say, learn your history, learn the nation's history, learn world history from all kinds of lenses. We started off by talking about equity lens. So from all kinds of lenses, all kinds of aspects, and then form your own opinion. And most importantly, live in brave spaces. We talk a lot about safe spaces. No space is really safe. Live in brave spaces, spaces where you can challenge one another positively, where you can learn from one another. And I want to reemphasize to follow your moral compass and to open your heart up, because this is heart work. It's hard work, but it's heart work, and to not step back from it when it becomes uncomfortable. So that we always say, get comfortable being uncomfortable, but those words are very powerful because this is not easy, but it is doable. And if we don't see it in our lifetime, we're planting the seeds first. Often we plant seeds for fruit from trees that we never see. But those seeds will blossom, those trees will grow, and they will grow fruit. And if our foremothers had stopped from being tired, we wouldn't be on this panel together right now, particularly for me as a Black woman, as a president of a university in Austin, Texas. So stay encouraged and stay in the big, good fight.
Thank you so much to each of you for sharing so much of you with all of us. To everyone who's tuning in, thank you for spending the hour. I know it's a busy time, so making this a priority means so much to all of us. We'll be back with another LINK Changemakers series in the near future. Our next topic is on healthcare, and we've assembled some of the best healthcare leaders from across our country. And I'm raising that here because the discussion we just had has to be part of the healthcare discussion moving forward, and we'll make sure that that's weaved in. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.